Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Tabadlab Live. Today, we're really privileged to have with us Ian Bremmer. Ian doesn't really need an introduction in any way, but of course, the founder and director and Ruhe Ravan, as we say in Urdu, of the Eurasia Group, founder and sort of curator of GZERO Media, and really one of the sage voices for what happens next in the world. I want to talk, Ian. Ian, thank you for doing this. And there's a whole bunch of questions. We have very limited time today, so I just want to jump right in. I read, like many people here in Pakistan, and I'm sure around the region, read the piece you wrote about what was happening here in this country vis-a-vis the coronavirus. And one of the things I was surprised by, it was a very insightful piece. I highly recommend it, and it will pop up on the screen, and there'll be a link on the YouTube posting. But one of the things I was surprised by in the piece is that you didn't really talk very much about what Pakistan is facing in terms of a really angry India, and an India that is convinced that one of the ways that it can be a better version of itself is by annexing Kashmir, by talking down to Pakistan, and by doing other things. I'm convinced that Indian state authorities are involved in all sorts of things that that are icky in terms of supporting various groups, insurgent groups. There's lots of conversation and lots of circumstantial evidence that points in that direction. But I think Pakistanis find it really hard to convince Westerners that India's the bad guy in this region. Tell me why.
Well, first, tell you why I didn't write about it. I mean, I was writing about Pakistan's response to coronavirus. And I mean, coronavirus is the most important global story right now. People that read Time magazine aren't necessarily geopolitical experts. This might be the only piece they read about what's happening in Pakistan. So, I mean, you kind of don't want to lose that with, okay, let's talk about India too. And actually, Pakistan is mishandling this. It's really interesting. The relationship with the military is important. The relationship with the clerics is important. So that's why I just, you got one page. That's what I did with it. Obviously, then I understand that right now, when you look from an American perspective, there are not a lot of allies out there that are particularly aligned with my president, President Trump. His relationship with Modi is one of his better relationships around the world. You'll remember the Howdy Modi event in Texas, where, I mean, unlike in Tulsa, Oklahoma a couple weeks ago, they filled a big stadium, 100,000 chanting people that were there for Modi and there for Trump. That was a big deal. And when Trump went to India, of course, it was reciprocated. Pakistan, the relationship with the United States, the aid has largely been cut off. Pakistan's international support is largely from China. India, for a long time, has not wanted to play geopolitics, has wanted to be more of a neutral, the non-aligned movement director. Now, very clearly moving into the West's camp. Maybe not so much on national security issues directly. They're still buying an awful lot of military equipment from Russia, for example. But I mean, they just kicked out TikTok. They just blocked another 58 Chinese apps. So, I mean, in the technology Cold War, India is increasingly firmly on the West, on the American side. And Pakistan, you're talking about a country which is a significantly Muslim population. I mean, there is a Hindu population, and indeed they've been pretty mistreated. And that's also made the news recently in terms of the Hindu temple that was supposed to be allowed built and not, and, the judicial rights and privileges kind of thrown out. But of course, in India, it's a Hindu nationalist government. And it's made a lot of policies on the back of treating Muslims like second-class citizens, and particularly Muslims, as opposed to a number of other minority populations inside India. For all of those reasons, the United States is going to pay more attention to India as a friendly face. And also, let's be clear, the Indian expat community has done incredibly well, particularly in Silicon Valley in the United States. They've politically become more loud, more motivated, more mobilized. And so I would say just generally, there's a greater orientation towards India than there is towards Pakistan. It's all kind of rowing in the same direction right now.
And so, I mean, that sort of realpolitik view then leads me to believe that the China-India dynamic, which was substantially escalated, as you saw in Galwan Valley, that will further expand the relationship between India and the US, in the sense that, India is able to now point to China, look at Uncle Sam with sort of, beady eyes, and sort of, and kind of say, look, we're getting picked on by the one, global power that, seems to want to pick a fight with you as well. So maybe it's time for us to dance a little slower and a little closer.
Yeah, I mean, it was Rex Tillerson in his very brief stint as Secretary of State that talked about this Indo-Pacific group, and not much was done with it in the first couple years of the Trump administration. That's now picking up again. You hear Pompeo talking about it. You hear the Australians talking about it. Of course, Shinzo Abe in Japan has the strongest relationship of any foreign leader with Modi, and that's been consistent. So, I mean, all of those things I think help. I do believe that the Indian government really wants to de-escalate the fight, the military fight with the Chinese in the valley. Obviously, they are outmatched immensely by the Chinese. So, I mean, yes, they have expanded their troops in the border region, but the response to China after these 20 plus Indian soldiers were killed has been exclusively in the economic zone, while the bilateral diplomacy between the Indians and Chinese has been intense and fairly constructive so far. So, I mean, for me, I think that the Indian government itself, I mean, Modi's doing pretty well in terms of domestic popularity ratings right now. He doesn't need a fight with the Chinese to stoke his own domestic popularity the way he did with Pakistan, and with the decision, for example, to unilaterally annex Kashmir, which was enormously popular both inside India as well as externally with the Indian diaspora. So I'm not sure that you're going to see the Indians pushing for escalation here. But yeah, I mean, at the margins, I think that generally helps support the narrative. More importantly is the fact that the Chinese, after the Chinese were the first to get their supply chain up and running again, following their outbreak in coronavirus and their cover-up, of course, of coronavirus, there was a lot of backlash. And backlash in their humanitarian diplomacy, their mass diplomacy, their test kit diplomacy, a lot of which was heavy-handed, some of which didn't work. And in a number of countries that are calling for investigations into the beginning of coronavirus, which the Chinese have strongly opposed, the trade war that's escalating with the Australians, for example, the Huawei fight, which is playing out over Taiwan, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, and other countries right now, and of course Hong Kong, where the Chinese unilaterally put a new national security law in place that really changes life for the everyday Hong Kong citizen and puts an end to the one state, two systems rule, which Hong Kong had enjoyed since the 1997 handover. They don't anymore. And so, I mean, China, you could argue they've overplayed their hand, or you could say that Xi Jinping is actually in a more difficult position because his economy is not growing this year, despite a stimulus of 6% of GDP. And domestically, for that reason, and because a lot of people have suffered from coronavirus and a very strong-armed response by the government to make sure that there wasn't broader transmission, a lot of Chinese are not happy with their leadership right now. And the fact that they can't express it, they're scared to demonstrate, they'll be censored in social media, doesn't make them any happier. So I do think that there's a strong argument to be made that a lot of what China is doing right now is not out of strength. It's actually out of weakness. And that makes you worry a bit that if the Americans continue to push harder, what might a more risk acceptant Chinese government actually do that could upset the apple cart?
Well, the notion of Chinese weakness, obviously a popular one in the West, but not very popular, as you know, Ian, here in Pakistan, where I think one of the sort of guarantors or maybe not guarantors is too strong a word, but the most sustained and stable relationship Pakistan has with any country, despite its closeness to the US, particularly in the last year or so, is actually with China. So it would be, how would, if you were advising Pakistani leaders who feel like they've gone all out for the Americans when it comes to Afghanistan over the last 18 months or so, and certainly an instrumental role in helping, manage the Taliban and squeezing and massaging and getting them to the table. How should Pakistan play it? Because a lot of folks here feel like there's some sort of compulsion on Pakistan to choose one or the other. Whereas my own view, and this is what I want to test with you, is that Pakistan should not at all choose one or the other. In fact, Pakistan has played the role of bridge in the days when Henry Kissinger was in government, and should continue to seek out that very fine sort of, thin line along which it navigates the space between China and the US.
Well, it's obviously getting harder for Pakistan to do that, right? I mean, in part because China's economic role in the region is growing. And the Belt and Road has been a two-edged sword, particularly for Pakistan, where a lot of promised investment was suspended, in part because of corruption, bad governance, concerns about, debt actually being able to be collected by Pakistan long term. So, I understand that getting in bed with the Chinese is not easy, but also because the Americans cut the Pakistanis off, and this Trump administration has not been, has not been one of the easier administrations to engage with. A lot of Americans just don't care as much about foreign policy and don't want the Americans to play the same role in Afghanistan. So what if Pakistan's been helpful at the margins in Afghanistan? The average American just wants to get out of Afghanistan. And one of Trump's policies that's considerably more popular than we saw under the Obama administration or we would under a Biden administration. So, I mean, understandably, look, I would say that I am deeply sympathetic to your orientation. I would think anyone in your position in the region, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, would want to be able to continue to hedge between the Americans and Chinese to the extent that it's possible. If you're Pakistan in this environment, it's becoming harder. Having said that, I don't think Imran Khan does himself any favors when he talks about Osama bin Laden as being martyred by the United States, and the idea that Pakistan did nothing wrong and had no credible intelligence on what he was doing and what was going on inside the Pakistan's territory. I don't think he does any favors by being seen as a puppet of the Pakistani military and trying to take power away from a more decentralized federal system, which seems like it has more transparent governance to those of us in the West. So, I mean, I don't think, the fact that he was allowing, when everyone was trying to lock down, and he's saying, I'm not locking down mosques, you guys can go and continue to pray and get together, and there's no concerns. I mean, there's a reason why Pakistan's, despite lack of testing, Pakistan's had an explosion of case rate. And that's going to make it a lot harder for people to welcome Pakistanis to our countries, for them to work in the high value jobs and send money back home, the remittances to Pakistani families that need that money. So, I mean, the first thing, before you get to geopolitics, when you're in a crisis of this size, the first thing you want to do is get your own house in order, lead. This is the biggest crisis of our lifetimes. And the governments that have done a good job, they're not democracies or authoritarian states. They're not poor or rich. There are a bunch of countries around the world who have leaders that don't have such big egos. They're willing to focus on expertise and science. They're not cheerleading. They're telling their people the hard news, and they're trying to bring everyone together. Vietnam, Greece, Argentina. These are not poster children for advanced industrial democracies. These are just countries led by people that are trying to do the right thing. And then, of course, there are some wealthier countries like New Zealand and Norway and Iceland, and then South Korea, Germany, and Canada that have done exemplary jobs, and are very wealthy. But I'm saying, even if you're Pakistan, where life is not easy, unfortunately, the leadership of Pakistan did a bad job, has done a bad job in responding to this crisis. And so the idea of are we going to manage China versus the United States? Well, if you can't even manage the coronavirus crisis domestically, I don't know that I'm going to give you much useful advice on how to manage China versus the United States. There's no Kissinger showing up over there.
Well, surely, because in the list of countries that have done a really bad job managing the coronavirus, if there's three countries that have done a worse job, it just so happens that they might be India, China, and the United States. I think Brazil probably tops that group. Uh,
Brazil tops that group, and
yeah,
China's a really weird one
yeah,
because China did a horrible job for the first month.
sure.
But then, I mean, my God, in terms of testing levels and quarantine and contact tracing and lockdown and getting their economy back up and running, by May, supply chain in China was running again, right?
Well, and I
So
think what happened in
it's hard to
Pakistan.
it's hard to know about China. What? Hmm?
Well, so I think what's interesting about Pakistan is that actually Pakistan's response in the first month and a half was actually pretty smart. The shutting
Yep.
down of the borders,
Shutting down.
shutting down the
Yep.
economy, there was actually some really good decisions.
Yep.
I've kind of given up on the response ever since Ramadan because, as you mentioned, the choice of the night prayers during the holy month and before that, the Jummah prayers, I think those indicated where things were headed. And then the
Yep.
prime minister's insistence on lives versus livelihoods, which is actually a false binary. So I totally agree. The response hasn't been as good as it could have been. But I guess where I would sort of ask you to say more is in the U.S. and India, two of the other countries that
Yep.
really matter for Pakistani geopolitics. The response has been even more shambolic, if that was possible.
The United States response has been really, really split.
Okay.
The economic response of the United States has been one of the most effective of any country in the world to date. The Fed response has been extraordinary. I don't know a single Democrat, not one Democrat. I mean, I've spoken at length with, all of the former Fed chiefs, Treasury secretaries, and Jack Lew, Larry Summers, you name it. They've all told me Powell has done an exemplary job, and no one's interfering with them. And Congress, bipartisan, over 10%, relief, recovery, and stimulus, really effective. And I think you're going to get another 1 trillion plus. Incredibly divided Congress, you're still getting it done. And I mean, there's a reason why the markets are pretty positive right now in the U.S. There's a reason why we're seeing more of a faster rebound economically in the U.S. than a lot of people would have otherwise expected. Now, the healthcare response, the PPE response, the testing response, and the coordination with other countries, disaster. I mean, we had Anthony Fauci, who I like personally, coming out in the first months and saying, don't use masks, because they were worried that we weren't the superpower in the world, worried that we're not going to have enough masks for our frontline workers and that there's going to be a run on them. How is that possible that the United States is telling its citizens don't wear masks because we think we won't have enough for our hospital workers? It's insanity. And
I don't know if you noticed. I don't know if you noticed, but Pakistan sent a plane full of PPE to the United States about a month ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. It's
remarkable.
It's insanity. It's insanity. And so, I mean, I think that if you're grading the United States, you can't even say the U.S. gets a C. What you say is it gets like an A- on economics, and it gets like a D- on healthcare, and the international front. And I don't know how you average those things.
Sure.
Right? It's really hard. And we see that we're seeing expanded cases in the United States, in many states right now, not my own, but in many of the states around the country, precisely because we have a Center for Disease Control. It actually provided guidelines for opening after lockdown, and about 24 states in the United States simply ignored those parameters, which is, again, insane, right? I mean, you do not want political leaders second guessing the world's top experts. You just don't want that.
No, absolutely. Look, what did you think of India's response?
I thought that the initial rollout, the speech that Modi gave, was problematic. It was not detailed. It caused a lot of panic. It was a surprise to a lot of people who had no way to get back home, and that led to a lot more transmission. It also led to some panic buying because they thought that suddenly, essential stores, pharmacies were closed when they actually weren't. Having said that, the fact that Modi actually does control the BJP And so he was able to roll out a level of authority for those that were, governors, chief ministers that are underneath them, and they did what he told them to do, which would have been a lot harder to do under other leaders historically. I think led to a more positive and constructive response domestically than you otherwise would have gotten, and more willingness of India to have longer lockdowns than other countries in its position might have. So that's somewhat positive. And then I would say on the economic front, India's been kind of a joke. They made some serious, very substantial promises in terms of the stimulus they were going to provide, and the vast majority of it was smoke and mirrors. It was money that had already been committed through the budget, wasn't really going to help people, especially who are participating in the informal economy, and that puts more pressure on them to reopen the economy before it really is appropriate to do so, given the phase of this disease. And look, countries like India, Pakistan, they're going to be under a lot more pressure because, look, younger populations not going to see a lot more asymptomatic cases. They can't test as well. The healthcare isn't what it is in the wealthy world, and you're not going to see enough aid to help these people that are losing their jobs, losing their livelihood. So, I mean, I do understand that that those leaders are going to have a different response to the equation of how much lockdown can we tolerate. I get that, but again, big mistakes made by both of these leaders.
So, what's interesting is that no matter what Modi does, whether it's demonetization or it's Kashmir or it's the flare up with Pakistan or the flare up with China, he's Teflon in his favorability numbers, his positive numbers. They stay where they are. Do you think that that's going to, well, I think I know the answer to this, but how much of the failures on the public health side, states that were red, like Arizona and Florida, that are just getting battered by COVID-19, do you think that's going to play out in November at the election in the U.S., or do you think, much like Modi, Donald Trump's base is going to come out and support him no matter what?
Again, I mean, Modi was losing a lot of approval because his economic reforms were falling flat. He had basically a financial and a corporate crisis at home in the run-up to his elections. He was losing states. He was in danger of not gaining re-election. Then he plays the Hindu nationalism card and things go a lot better for him. Plus, his opposition is in complete disarray, which certainly helps.
Well, he started a war with Pakistan. That was really the turning point for his election.
I mean, I don't know if I'd call it a war. I mean, that's like saying that, the U.S. invaded Grenada. You call that a war. It didn't go very far. And it's not even clear that the deep bomber attacks were killing anybody. We still don't. It looks like it was just like a flag-waving exercise. But it was very effective. And that's the point. So, but I think in the United States, I mean, Trump's not looking to go to war with anybody, in my view, including even the phase one trade deal with the Chinese. He's been careful to try to keep that in place. But his approval ratings are in the tank right now. He's at about 40%. He's about 5 points down, even in swing states against Biden. Now, that's a lot of wood to chop. And, just playing the racist card in the United States is not enough wood to chop. So that's not going to win it for you. Now, let's keep in mind that when we get to November, the third quarter in the U.S. economically is going to look pretty damn good. It's going to look pretty good with a horrible first and second quarter. So, I mean, you're still going to have double-digit unemployment. You're still going to have a contraction of 6 to 8% of the U.S. economy in 2020. But when Trump is the one dominating the news cycle, he's going to have momentum. And I think that is, momentum matters a lot. So, I mean, most of my Democrat friends, and truth in advertising here, I've never been a member of a political party, but my friends that are Democrats and that support Biden no matter what, they're pretty confident right now that Biden's going to win. And in fact, it's a pretty good shot that he's just going to sweep the Senate. I think it's very early to say that. I think we've got 4 months. And frankly, even though Trump's made a lot of mistakes, he knows how to campaign. He's got a formidable machine, and the winds of the economy. I mean, he's in a storm, but he may well have a couple good waves, and that's an interesting thing.
Ian, I know we have a hard stop, but if I can just ask you to address one really interesting, so obviously one of your books, Superpower, I think, you know, in terms of where we are in the region that I'm in here in Pakistan and what we've been talking about, there's a passage or a paragraph in the question mark America section, which actually almost perfectly sets up what's happening right now. This book was, of course, written in like between 2015 and 2016. But it's fascinating. I feel like reading it out. I don't know if we have time for that, but readers can find it. So Washington must also decide how and whether to more deeply engage India. US leaders have debated for years how best to improve relations with the world's most populous democracy without undermining efforts to better engage India's most powerful rivals, China and Pakistan. If Americans are to seize the opportunity provided by Indian anxiety over China's rise and Pakistan's instability to deepen political, commercial, and security ties with Delhi, the US must make a long-term commitment to try and overcome decades of mistrust between the two countries. But if Americans conclude that it's best for the US if India, China, and Pakistan begin to manage their territorial and sectarian disputes without US involvement, then the signals from Washington must be unambiguous. Yeah, it's really prophetic. And I mean, it just goes to speak to why, you know, you are, you know, Ian Bremmer, because here we are. And I don't think question mark America has answered the question.
It's
I
not
think
been
4 years
resolved,
later, we're still.
well, but you're right. But there's one thing that's changed since I wrote that book, and that's the technology Cold War. That was not in place in 2015. It is in 2020, and that's something that you don't get to choose. I mean, you don't get to do both. You know, you have to either be on, because you have to have apps. You got to have big data. You got to have a digital currency, and you're going to be on the U.S. side or the Chinese side. And I think that it's interesting that the fact that that is right now pulling the Indians towards the West and the United States may help to make that decision without the Americans doing nearly as much. I mean, the Americans pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. India's not doing it either, right? So, I mean, that would argue that the Indians, the Chinese, Pakistan, they're all going to kind of manage and do their own thing over time, except that the most important part of the 21st century economy is taking India, which has more data than anyone on the planet except China, and it's aligning them to the big American companies. That's pretty interesting. So, I mean, that's a piece that's going to play out over the next few years.
And I don't think Mike Pompeo was acting foolishly or ignorantly when he raised the question of TikTok being banned in the US less than 10 days after Modi banned it in India.
Absolutely not. They see what's coming. They think this is a useful play for them. Yeah.
We got to keep talking, Ian. This was awesome as always. Thank you so much for your time today.
Good to see you, my friend. Take it easy.
Thanks a lot.